We live in a world shaped by crisis, economic, political, natural, and we rarely stop to consider how these catastrophes are often not just accidents of history, but carefully exploited opportunities to impose radical change. This is the central thesis of Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, one of the most provocative and revealing books of the 21st century. In her meticulous investigation, Klein takes us on a journey that uncovers how disaster capitalism has become a global political and economic strategy, transforming moments of vulnerability into platforms for power and profit. The story begins with a single idea, that shock, trauma, and disorientation can be used as weapons. Just as doctors once experimented with electroshock therapy in an attempt to erase mental trauma and rebuild the human mind, economists and politicians began applying social and economic shocks to erase old structures and erect new ones, almost always neoliberal in nature, promoting privatization and centralization of power. Klein traces the origins of this logic with historical precision. Its roots, she argues, lie in the Chicago School of Economics under the leadership of Milton Friedman. For Friedman, were the perfect time to apply radical free market reforms. The theory was simple. During times of stability, societies resist drastic changes. But in moments of shock, disoriented populations are more likely to accept policies that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Mass privatizations, deep public spending cuts, deregulation, and labor flex. Bitter medicine of neoliberal economics were administered under the guise of recovery and progress. Klein's narrative gains momentum as she analyzes the 1973 coup in Chile. The overthrow of President Salvador Allende and the rise of Augusto Pinochet provided a real-world laboratory for the Chicago School's ideas. Under Friedman's guidance and with the help of the Chicago Boys, Chile's economy underwent brutal neoliberal restructuring. Public schools were privatized, state-owned companies were sold, and labor unions were crushed. Political repression and institutionalized violence became the pillars that upheld these reforms. Social suffering was the price paid for an economic recovery that benefited the few and marginalized the many. It was shock doctrine in action: destabilize, implement, consolidate. But Chile was far from an isolated case. The doctrine spread like a silent virus through other Latin American countries, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and eventually reached Western powers. Margaret Thatcher's United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan's United States implemented calculated economic shocks designed to dismantle the welfare state, cut taxes for the wealthy, weaken unions, and open their economies to speculation and international capital. In each case, crisis, whether runaway inflation, recession, or geopolitical conflict, became the perfect gateway to impose an ideological agenda that could never pass. Democratically, during peacetime, Klein's voice grows stronger as she reveals how natural disasters and wars were also weaponized to implement neoliberal reforms. After Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, for example, the public school system was dismantled and replaced with private charter schools, a plan that had existed prior to the disaster but would never have gained popular support without the institutional vacuum the catastrophe created. This pattern of shock, followed by neoliberal reconstruction, would repeat itself over and over after the Southeast Asian tsunami, during the Iraq War, and in Greece's debt crisis. In every case, collective suffering became a window of opportunity for political and economic elites to carry out sweeping changes in the name of progress. In post-2003 Iraq, the shock doctrine reached one of its most blatant manifestations. Following the US-led invasion, the country was plunged into political and social chaos that paved the way for the complete privatization of its economy. Foreign corporations, mostly American, flooded in, often enjoying tax exemptions, legal impunity, and unchecked authority. The Iraqi state was dismantled from the top down, and reconstruction was driven not by the needs of the population, but by market interests. The promised democracy never arrived, but the new economic order was implemented to the letter. Shock wasn't merely a side effect of war, it was a deliberate strategy. Klein reveals that the shock doctrine is not just an economic methodology, it is a form of political domination. The more disoriented people are, the less they resist. In authoritarian regimes, shock comes through force. In democracies, it is sold as inevitability. In both scenarios, the population loses control over its choices, social rights are reduced to costs, and citizens are demoted to consumers. She also highlights how, over time, capitalism itself was reconfigured to exploit disasters as a business model. A full-fledged shock industry emerged, made up of companies specializing in private security, post-disaster reconstruction, surveillance, and population control. These corporations profit from chaos. For them, every catastrophe is a growing market. War becomes a service, disaster becomes an investment opportunity, and pain turns into currency. Shock, then, is no longer accidental, it is often manufactured or amplified. The Shock Doctrine is not just a book of denunciation, it is also a call to critical consciousness. Klein insists that the true antidote to this logic is memory, the ability to remember how things were before, to question narratives of inevitability, and to resist solutions imposed during moments of desperation. She invites us to look beyond the surface of crises and ask, who benefits from them? Behind every adjustment, every tough measure, there are vested interests, and those interests rarely align with the well-being of the majority. That's why understanding the Shock Doctrine is vital. It's present in the privatization of public services, in austerity packages, in labor reforms that erode rights, in weakened environmental protections framed as economic necessity. It's found in developing countries forced by international institutions to adopt inequality-deepening policies after debt crises. It's in cities where, after a tragedy, poor residents are displaced under the guise of urban renewal. The Shock Doctrine is everywhere, and that's exactly why it must be exposed. Klein's work is also a defense of hope and resistance. Throughout her narrative, she highlights social movements, community leaders, and entire populations who, even in the face of violent shocks, refused to accept the official story. People who occupied public squares, challenged unpopular reforms, rebuilt their communities without market intervention, and reinvented forms of solidarity. For Klein, these resistances are living proof that another world is possible, and it begins with the courage to say no. Amidst the chaos, the documentary narrative proposed in this text reveals a disturbing pattern but also a chance for disruption. By understanding how the Shock Doctrine operates, we are empowered to resist it. We realize that crises don't have to be opportunities for power grabs and wealth consolidation. They can also be moments of reinvention, democratic strengthening, and the building of more just and resilient societies. The documentary inspired by the Shock Doctrine is thus more than a portrait of historical abuse. It is both a warning and an invitation. A warning against becoming captives of fear, urgency, and the illusion of inevitability, and an invitation to resist, to organize, and to build alternatives. Because, as Klein shows us, shock can be used to dominate, but it can also awaken us.